Welcome back to Return to More. I'm Jonathan Moore, host of Return to More. Today's episode is entitled Grief as a Gateway. And today we're going to be exploring how grief shows up not just in times of death, but also when we experience other losses, other transitions, whether the end of a relationship or perhaps the move to a new city. My guest today is Oz Escobel, who is the clinical director and psychotherapist of Awakening LLC. Oz, who was born and raised in Guatemala, experienced loss early in life, and he credits that as not only helping him on his journey, but also on his journey to helping others. Before we invite Oz into the conversation, I want to share a reflection with you about ways in which grief has impacted me. So in this segment of More to Reflect On, I want to share a story about my Aunt Madeline. So my Aunt Madeline is my mom's older sister. They're about 4 years apart. In my family dynamic, I was the baby of the family. My mom had me when she was 33 years old. As you can imagine, not too many women were having their first or only child in their 30s. But here I was, born to my mom when she was 33. As you can imagine, that put me as the baby of the family. My cousin, who was closest to me in age, was 8 years my senior. And so as you can imagine, I was 1, she was 8. I was 8, she was 16. So a lot of life differences. And so she was around my older cousins who were able to experience things and engage in ways that I simply could not just because I was younger. Now back to my Aunt Madeline, she was the matriarch of the family. After my grandparents passed away, she assumed the role of the family manager, as you would say. You probably have in your mind the stereotypical oldest sibling who likes to direct traffic, boss people around, gets everyone together, both literally and figuratively. That was my Aunt Madeline. Most family gatherings were held at her home for holidays, special occasions, and by all accounts, she was my mom's best friend. They were sisters, obviously, but very similar in many ways, but also very different. And when I think about my earliest memories of my Aunt Madeline, I think about going to family events and family functions that my Aunt Madeline would host. And because I was young and grew up in your typical, what you would say, conservative family, where children were seen and not heard, where children were silent and less spoken to, I found myself often relegated to the basement. While adults would be engaged in adult fun, playing cards, eating, laughing, drinking, I would be in the basement, in many ways comfortable with my toys, my Game Boy, my PlayStation, my Nintendo, or even just a good movie or a book, mind you. But nevertheless, being relegated to the basement, often not being allowed to interact. Even more importantly, there was something distinct about my Aunt Madeline. She had a big personality, right? If you can imagine, I liken her to Diana Ross meets Sandra Clark from 227. If you've ever seen the sitcom 227, Sandra Clark, who's played by Jackie Harry, is very lively, vibrant, loud, flirtatious, fun. People gravitate toward her, very much like my Aunt Madeline, which also made her the center of attention, not just in the family, but also in friendship circles as well. I never really had a close relationship with my Aunt Madeline. So I grew up in a family where I experienced quite a bit of love. I had aunts and uncles who did love on me and dote on me and compliment me and showed an interest in many of my hobbies, whether coming to school recitals or concerts or things of that nature. However, that was not really my Aunt Madeline. I don't recall having a relationship with her beyond one that's familial. I don't recall sharing interests or hobbies with her. Don't really recall her sharing in my interest or hobbies as well. So while growing up, I just always had distance. There was always distance between Aunt Madeline and myself. And this is an important lesson. Many of you may have children or have young people in your lives who may express sort of a discomfort around certain individuals or who may express discomfort around certain individuals. I think it's important to listen to that. And I don't mean to imply that discomfort necessarily means something nefarious or harmful or dangerous. It could also mean just simply a disconnect. And that disconnect could be born out of a difference in personalities, a difference in understanding. For me and my Aunt Madeline, I think there were many factors that resulted in the disconnect where I never felt a love, warm feeling from her. Now, by many accounts, she wasn't mean, she wasn't abusive, she wasn't harmful or dangerous. But compared to my other aunts who openly expressed their love and affection toward me, Aunt Madeline did not. So picture it. It's 1997. One of the days, my mom and myself, we go over to my Aunt Madeline's house. It was a Saturday. And as they would talk as sisters, they were in my Aunt Madeline's dining room. And I was told to go into spare bedroom, watch TV, play. And because I was rather precarious as a child, I didn't always listen. I love to eavesdrop. That's probably one of my challenges now, listening to too many adult conversations as a kid. But nevertheless, I found myself tiptoeing into the living room, peering around the dining room table. And I saw my mom and my Aunt Madeline clutching hands with tears in their eyes. And so as I sat there silently, then they both began to weep openly, loudly. And so then by that point, I couldn't contain myself. So I go around the corner and I say, "What's wrong?" So they invite me to the table while they're both holding hands. And my mom looks at me and says, "Madeline has lung cancer." Now, lung cancer was the same illness that took their mother, that took many of their aunts and uncles. And that, of course, would sadly go on to claim the lives of other individuals in the family. But me being approximately 13, I had no overall awareness of what was to come, but knowing that it was serious and that she would begin to seek medical treatment. What I didn't know in that moment is that her diagnosis was essentially terminal. And so over the course of the next year and a half, my mother, being her best friend, the closest to her, devoted the remainder of my Aunt Madeline's life to being her caregiver. And so what that meant was my mom and I found ourselves living with my Aunt Madeline while my mom worked to care for her. Now, lest you think, well, where are the other family members? Where are Madeline's children? Madeline had children who were not necessarily present or around. And then, of course, many of us who have big families can relate to different dynamics. And the dynamic of this family was such that my mom was the one who was going to care for her sister and her best friend. And so that meant I was as well. So we move into my Aunt Madeline's house, and what would start as a journey of a year and a half, watching my Aunt Madeline's health decline. And so as you heard me recount, my Aunt Madeline and I did not have the warmest relationship. However, in the twilight of her life, she found herself with me as sort of a buddy, best friend. Moments where my mom would have been at work or not available, I was there to assist, to tend to her needs. And in those final 2 years of her life, we actually became really close. She took an active interest in learning about what was happening with me in school, my hobbies, whether music or tennis. We talked about pop culture, things that I had been yearning to do and that I in many ways talked about with other family members, but never with her. And so one memory that lingers is that I remember my mom, who worked at a steel mill at the time, and so she worked swing shifts. So some days or weeks, she would work 3 to 7. Some weeks she'd work midnights. Some weeks she'd work like 3 to 11. So she had a varied schedule. And so this was one night, late at night, it was going into a Saturday, and I hear my aunt calling my name. And so I'm in my room sleeping, hear my aunt calling my name. And so I get up, get out of bed. And by this time, her health had begun to really decline. This was one of the few days where she remained in the home before she was hospitalized for what would be the end of her life. And she had had an accident in the bed. And as my mom would always do, obviously help her clean up and help her get organized to make her comfortable. No one was at the house but me. And so me being observant, watching all the things my mom did, and obviously having a checklist, just being the backup caregiver at 13, that's what I did. I was able to help my Aunt Madeline get changed, get her organized, and for what seemed like few hours, which probably may have only been 30 minutes, found myself getting ready to return to bed when she says, "Hey, Jonathan, can you sit with me for a little bit?" So I remember crawling into bed with her, TV's on, lights on, and we're just talking. And for the first time ever, she says, "I'm really proud of you." And I remember in that moment, it wasn't emotional then because I was 113. I was also tired because by that time it was like 3 in the morning. A lot was happening. She said, "I'm really proud of you." And she said, "You're a nice young man." And I try not to get emotional now. And so she says, "You're a nice young man." And so that then lingered with me. I'll fast forward to 1999. My Aunt Madeline passes away. She succumbs to lung cancer after a nearly 2-year battle. And what hits me now, nearly 30 years later, is as I've tried to process the grief of losing her, once again, keeping in mind we weren't that close. The last 2 years we became really close. And I often wonder is because there was no one else around or if she really had a change of heart near the end of her life. But I also began to appreciate her and listening to stories she would share. And as I became an adult, I often found myself thinking about many of the ways in which we were similar. And so part of the journey through grief with her is I now think back 30 years later since she's passed. And I don't necessarily find myself grieving the person she was, per se, even though I do miss my aunt and her death left an indelible imprint, not just on my mom, but on the family dynamic itself. But I often find myself grieving what could have been. So I think back to 30 years without my Aunt Madeline, and I think about what life could have been like had she still been here. Could our relationship have evolved? Could we have become closer? If not for cancer, or if not for terminal cancer, that period that brought us closeness, could that have been sustained? And so in this moment, or in this instance that I share with you, I find myself grieving the possibility. Yes, I do miss my aunt. Once again, we didn't have a close relationship, and I can't say that I know her as well as I do my other aunts, or that maybe she knew me as well. But I think about those final 2 years that I spent with the final 2 years of her life that I spent with her, and I think about what could have been different if that time were sustained and carried through into the 30 years now as I sit here in my 40s. So for today's segment of More to Learn, I'm so excited to welcome Oz to the conversation. Welcome, Oz.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for having me.
No, please go ahead.
No, before I begin, I just want to appreciate you and acknowledge, for sharing your story with us. It really does come to highlight the importance of these conversations and why they matter.
Well, thank you, Oz. I believe I read somewhere that you too experienced a loss when you were younger, the loss of your father, and that really helped shape not only your journey through grief, but how you support others. Can you say more about that?
Yes. First, I want to acknowledge the fact that, we come to understand this grief as an endpoint, right? Something that ends. And whether this is implicit or explicit, right? It is a belief that, we carry with us, right? It is also something that we are taught to move on or to get over, or that time will heal, right? These are some factors that may in some capacity be true. However, grief is not a destination. It's not an end point, but rather a journey that we need to come to understand. In my case, to your question, as you shared, right, I came to learn about grief not when it happened, but rather until I was an adult, right? So a little context here. My father died when I was 6 years old, and there was so much context there, but it was a traumatic death. I was with him when this happened, and so in that moment, right, like it did really reshape not only what I was experiencing then, but truly, when I look back, it reshaped the entire landscape of my life. right? Growing up in Guatemala, being the older of, in this case, 4 siblings, I didn't feel like I had a place in which I could mourn. Not only didn't feel like I had the space, but I didn't even know what mourning was. I didn't really understand what losing someone was, except for how it felt like for me, right? And so I went on many years, and adults in my life would ask how did I feel, or if I remembered anything particular about that night. And while there were parts of my brain that did have this information, there was this other part of me that did not want to share that with anyone for different reasons. And in this case, right, like the way that I remember that was because that felt so personal to me, and people asking in a way felt invasive.
Yeah.
It felt like they didn't get to have access to this pain, because in a way it was the only thing that connected me to my father in this case.
So sacred in many ways. The pain was sacred.
Exactly, and it was something that felt both painful, but also something like I wanted to protect. I wanted to preserve for myself only, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a point in which that made sense to me, right? While simultaneously growing up and in something that you shared about the possibility of the relationship, right? Something that oftentimes came up for me was what life would look like, or what it could look like had my father been alive. What life could have looked like had I had access to both of my parents when I needed support, I needed guidance, or maybe I needed feedback in how to go about life.
And would you say that that's healthy? We've often heard when it comes to grief, especially, like, you can't change what's been, or you should look forward, or you shouldn't dwell in the past. But as you and I are both talking about the images of what life could have been like had our loved ones still been here, what is your take on that perspective of the imagination of what could be or what could have been?
This is a part of grief that is so fascinating, right? Because when we think of grief, and there's of course different types of griefs, but in this case, when we think of grief, we think of the loss of the physical, right? The loss of the person themselves. What we do not really understand is what is happening internally, what is happening physiologically to our body, that is experiencing such a rupture of the reality that we learn to exist in, right? As it is oftentimes the case, we also, and this is also a byproduct of the time that we live in, right? Like we are encouraged to visualize, to create a vision, to think forward about the future, even like with timing right now, right? Like we are thinking about next year and goals and what it is that we want to accomplish. Simultaneously learning to mourn the losses of the things that we didn't get to accomplish, right? So in many different sense, we learn to think about grief as the physical loss. We don't always think about the possibility of the relationship that we could have had with a person, with a plan, with a place, with a thing, right? And so what happens to that is really confusing for us.
Can you say more about, so you started to mention not just people, but places and things. We experience grief with those aspects of what as well. Can you say more about either how that's different from the loss of people, or how that even shows up similarly to when we lose people who are important to us?
Definitely. One of the most important things for us to understand about grief is that grief isn't only emotional or psychological. It's also about a physiological event happening in our bodies, right? That is fundamentally important to understand because we do not know what to do with the feelings, right? So let's start there. At a foundational level, our body goes in overdrive, experiencing a huge sense of rupture in the reality, as I said earlier, that we have learned to exist in. Right? our nervous system gets activated, and this is when, all our systems, right, like our lungs, our heart, our gut, right, like our digestive system are going through such an entire process that we don't really know what to do with that information, right? We experience loss in appetite, we experience fatigue, we experience this emptiness, this void in our hearts, that it almost feels as if somebody's ripping our chest, our heart out, right? And all of these things are confusing to us. Is that depression? Is a symptom of depression, right? Depression needs a lot more clinical pointers in order for it to be depression, but it is definitely a symptom of depression, of how it feels physiologically, right? And so the sympathetic system gets activated. This is your fight or flight response, right? Then the dorsal vagal system gets activated, and this is your freeze or shut down command, right? And sometimes we experience both, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other, or sometimes it doesn't really follow a sequence, right? And that is the point here, that sometimes we experience both. So people can feel, the physical symptoms of grief, right? Like the tightness in your chest, the lack of appetite, the shallow breathing, the numbness, alternating, right, between anxiety or agitation, right? And that is because your nervous system is going through what feels like a roller coaster, what we call it, right? Like a roller coaster of emotions. And so what your body at that point is trying to do is trying to regulate itself, right, from having experienced so much disruption, right? And so we go through that process, and your body is trying to protect itself. This is a primal response to a perceived or a real threat to safety or to self, right? So your nervous system is trying to regulate your body to protect itself, right? But it oftentimes feels completely different to us. Yeah. Right? We also think about grief as a sequence of steps that we have to follow, right? We know the 5 stages of grief, and because of pop psychology and the access to information that we have come to learn more about what the stages of grief are, not really understanding that they do not follow in sequence. They are not linear, right? It is not an all or nothing, right? It is a process that follows, that also really matters, right? How we tend to ourselves, how we tend to wherever it is that we are in our own process also matters, so that we can tend to ourselves. Sometimes I share, with people about feelings. Think about this from this perspective, like a compass, right? A compass is supposed to guide you. If you do not know how to read a compass or how it works, you will still get to your destination. You may take the long route there, right? Feelings, same way. Feelings are your internal directive system, right? It's your internal compass. So if we do not take our time trying to understand our feelings, what they are trying to guide us towards, which oftentimes is, as I mentioned, right, is towards self-regulation, then it doesn't mean that we will not heal, right? It means that we may take the long route there.
And so that leads me to one question as I think about my reflection, even as I recounted with my Aunt Madeline, right? 30 years later, I find myself having these feelings bubble up, well into adulthood many years later, about what I wish could have been. And so I offer that to say, I think many of us are grieving without even realizing it. And so you gave us some signs that, we could look for in the nervous system and the physical signs. But what happens, or when... Rephrase. So you gave us some symptoms that we could look for in the nervous system and the physical system. Also, you indicated that grief is not linear, right, as we go through the stages. And so what would you say to someone who may be in the throes of grief, but unsure of necessarily where they are in those stages, if that makes sense?
this is one of the reasons why expanding on our own understanding of grief is really important, right? Grief isn't only about death, as you were pointing out earlier, right? It's about the possibility of a relationship. Grief also includes, the ambiguous loss, right? Estrangement, right? Specifically with the holidays, we experience, moments of loneliness, right? Do we want to go home to our families, even when we understand that those relationships are complex? Do we want to be by ourselves, even though we know that there'll be a level of peace of mind that comes with that, right? It is also something that we mourn because we fear the loneliness, we fear the feelings that will come up for us, right? And so there is a part of ambiguous loss, right? Like not really understanding what we experience, but also knowing that there is an absence of something in our lives, right? There's also the invisible loss, right? Which, to the transitions, for instance, right? If we move from one city to another city, if we move from one apartment to another apartment, these are types of invisible laws, identities, right? Because there is a part of us that is going to require to adapt, to adjust to a new environment.
Yeah. Can we spend some time talking about that, especially because that resonates with me, and it may for many of the audience as well. The idea that life transitions, right, that don't just include death, but that may include the loss of a romantic relationship, or that may include the transition from one location to the next, or one job to the next, or which then, of course, the byproducts then becomes, your way of life has shifted, your friendship circles may have, shifted or adjusted, you're on the hunt for new friends or new relationships. Are the paths similar when you think about the framing that you offer for the loss of people? I mean, we're talking about grief, but the loss of people, is that same framework applicable to the loss of places and things?
Yes, it is very similar, right? And, I also want to emphasize here, grief, it is truly a personal experience. It is something that we will experience, and even when we have familiarity in the process, just to use an example, moving from a city to another city is going to feel very relative to what is happening in your life at that point, right? From doing it, let's say 2 years later, you may experience very similar feelings, symptoms of what you experienced 2 years prior, but this is also going to be relative to what is happening in your life at that point, right? Going back to some of my own experiences, as you mentioned, losing my father at an early age, right? And then going through all of my childhood, sort of like mourning that loss while simultaneously learning to adapt and adjust, to life as an older sibling, as sort of like this was truly an unspoken rule or expectation, but feeling responsible for my siblings and their well-being, even though my mom never really said that I had to do things. It is a responsibility that I just felt landed on me for many different reasons. So for a long time, that sort of like framework and adapting to that reality, it served me well because it fostered discipline, it fostered responsibility, it also fostered the ability, the resilience, exactly, the ability to manage and to think critically about the different needs that were happening in my life. That in itself, right, played a role because growing up was complicated for me. When I graduated high school, I immigrated to the United States, specifically to Boston, right after high school. And I think that just going to people, places, and things, right, this is when I experienced that first sort of like confrontation to a major loss that was not physical, right? It was a loss that, came with opportunity, right? Because that was the perspective, right? Like moving to another place, moving to the United States represented opportunity for me. And so, but it was also layered with grief and the loss of many things, right? To include my family, to include the place that I had always known to be home, to include a culture that I saw as mine and one that felt I belonged in. And so there was a loss of familiarity, loss of ease, and the loss of being understood without feeling I needed to explain myself.
You know, if we could put a pin there, that resonates with me for many reasons. One, because I too have moved quite a bit for career opportunities. I'm happy to be in the location where I currently am. But that concept was so innocuous, ambiguous, nebulous, just unclear. And so oftentimes I've had friends or family members who would move to a new city seeking either a fresh start or adventure, and then, you know, things don't work out, and so they find themselves back home. And while I try not to be judgmental, right, you know, secretly in the back of my mind, judge, especially those who go without a plan. But nevertheless, even with me, someone who was well-planned and well-intentioned about why I was moving to different places, found myself feeling sort of an emptiness. And it was until I put those experiences in the context of grief and how, you know, you articulated, you know, going someplace for opportunity, which was a positive foundation, but also leaving behind so much of your identity, your way of life, your living, as complex as it was. And we often don't take time to like sit in that and process these types of transitions in that way. So that really resonates with me when you talk about the transitions of even moving from place to place.
Definitely. And you know, like your experience, right, like many other people who has moved, whether it's, you know, cities, right, like left home because they just want a fresh start, or they need to leave, right, for different reasons. In my experience, I learned how to adapt outwardly while silently carrying you know, so many different experiences that shaped who I understood myself to be at that point, filled with loss, filled with sadness, while simultaneously filled with hope and desire and ambition, right? And so it also lends itself for a complicated process. This is where I go back to saying how what is happening in your life matters at that time, right? Because when I came to the United States, you know, I simultaneously was going through my own confrontation of my sexuality and what it meant to be a gay teenager then, right? And it was not something that I really understood either, right? I was looking outwardly, I was looking externally for ways in how I could bring language into myself in the way that I could bring understanding as to who I was, but I was looking for people, for the experiences externally to help me create a roadmap towards myself, right? So in a way, when grief isn't recognized, right, we learn to repress it, we learn to put it away, we learn to backfile it, because if all of the other things in life are going well, in quotations there, right, then in theory, it doesn't make sense why we continue to grieve if the rest of life is working out well.
So that leads to my next question that I have for you, which is about what are some then healthy ways that we can acknowledge grief? So given what you've just shared that I think many of us can relate to, how do we begin to acknowledge grief in a healthy way that's not repressive or that doesn't cause us to discard parts of ourselves or experiences that we have had? How can we begin to acknowledge grief in a way that's healthy?
You know, grief is one of the few experiences that invites us inwardly, right? It is truly something that happens inside, right? It reveals old wounds, it reveals unspoken hopes, it reveals, you know, hidden fears, the fragility and beauty of connection, right? There is so much depth sometimes that we get to confront when we learn to pay attention to our grief, right? So the first thing that it is important for us to do is to remove any judgment from the grief right? To not think that because you are not crying, you are not grieving. To not feel like you are in complete despair, that you are not grieving. That because you aren't planning a funeral or aren't tending to something, that then you are not grieving, right? So learning to remove the judgment from that. That needs to be the starting point. The point after that, and not that there has to be points, but after that, I think it is really important for us to bring awareness to what we are experiencing, right? Grief can also deepen connection, right? And so when we have someone and maybe we don't feel safe or secure having someone, this is something that we can do with ourselves as well, and just being able to bring language into some of the experiences that we are having in our body, right? Like bringing attention to how our chest may feel, or just allowing our body to decompress and to truly feel the feelings that it's having, whether that is confusion, whether that is anger, whether that is sadness. Maybe sometimes we just need to sit in the shock of the experience that we are having, right? Grief teaches us who feels safe in our life, who can stay present in our life, and who cannot.
I always say that there are 3 occasions, and I'm not the expert that you are, but I always say there are 3 occasions, as I point at the audience with my pen, there are 3 occasions that reveal who people truly are in your life. And I always say weddings, which I've never had but observed and been in plenty, divorces, never had but have observed and haven't been in plenty, but observed, and then deaths, especially to a loved one, can truly reveal who people are in your life. I've seen a number of relationships destruct or end, and obviously I imagine there may be underlying, it's no singular event, but just as you say that sticks out to me quite a bit, the idea of grief and the death or loss associated with that revealing to someone exactly who people are in their life, especially who their friends are, as well as those who may not mean them the best.
And yeah, definitely. And I can speak to all of those different experiences. I've had them all. Yeah. And as I shared with you prior, my experience into therapy didn't come from a single moment, right? As we are sort of like sharing right now, it is a combination of many different experiences that have helped me understand how to integrate, right, into this idea of grief by learning to release, by learning to let go. But it's not letting go in the sense of forgetting, or it's not about letting go in the sense of no longer caring or feeling. It's about learning to integrate that feeling, right, that loss, into something that you understand how to navigate, right? Think about you starting a new job, right? You go and it is disorienting, it is confusing, you are riddled with nerves and anxiety. There is so much excitement as well, right, for starting something new, while at the same time, there are all of these other feelings and thoughts associated with, the what if, right? And so when we learn to invite that as a process of something that is typical, right? It is something that we understand happens when you start something new, right? Yes, you understand that these are the steps and that this is how you're going to feel. And as best as possible, we can navigate that, right? With grief, it is important for us to learn to understand how to integrate all of these different components so that we are better equipped in learning how to navigate the landscape, right? The roadmap of our own experiences. Whether it's the first time that we're experiencing a loss, a physical loss, or a divorce, or a separation, or a transition, or so forth, grief becomes a part of the landscape of who we are. It no longer feels like it is the entirety of the landscape.
Yeah, I think for so many, as I'm listening to you, I'm having my own wow, about grief being the part of the landscape of who we are. And I think, and I can speak for me as well as those I've been in close proximity to, right? We look at grief, while we know there's steps, as a singular event, because you'll often hear, at some point, I should be over it. At some point, I should be past it. At some point, I should no longer be focused on it. But if it's a part of the landscape of who we are, then is it fair to say that grief just simply evolves? It's something we carry with us, and it evolves with us through different stages, through different life events, as we mature, as we transition, as we navigate life.
Yes. I once worked with a dear professor of mine through grad school, who after that became my supervisor during my clinical training. And she said something so fundamental and so truly basic in reality, but it landed and resonated with me. At that time, I was going through a separation, and so much of our discussions in supervision were about the experiences that I was having outside of the therapeutic room, right? She said to me, the feelings that you're experiencing right now are trying to tell you something, and feelings are much like a boomerang, right? We try to throw them away, they come right back. That is because there is something that we need to understand. That is something that we need to learn to deal with, so that it doesn't keep coming back up, at least not in the same way that it does. Right? So when we learn to think about grief in a way that it is part of the experiences, right? Part of the experiences that shape us, it also starts when we learn to think about grief in a way that is part of who or what has shaped us. We no longer view it as a threat, right? So we learn to move through it as part of the process that we're experiencing, as part of the chapter that we are in life, right? Another metaphor here, right? Think of a series that you may love very much, right? You get to, the second to last episode, right? And there is this part of you that is anticipating the last chapter, while at the same time not wanting for the season to be over, right? That is because we have developed this connection with the characters, with the show, right? And our grief is much the same way, right? Wow. We are looking forward to that next chapter. We want to see what happens after, while at the same time not wanting to let go of all of these different experiences, all of these previous chapters that came before, right? Because they have played such a pivotal role, such an important role in helping shape who we are in our own story.
Yeah. I think that's a powerful metaphor, not just for purposes of this discussion, but I'm sure we can all recount many of series that we wish were still running. But to hear you posit it that way, it really crystallizes both the concept of how our lives are sort of chapters that build on each other, but also when you mention the idea of characters, right? There are people who come in and out of our lives at different points, and as we evolve, the understanding or the idea that as we lose them or lose those things or people, that there is, and I don't know if it's fair to say, I guess is another question for you, is it fair to say that there's a requirement to process that loss?
That's a really good question. The answer is no, right? There's no requirement. However, it is something that we have come to learn, right? Like when we don't tend to our loss, we don't tend to our feelings, we don't tend to our grief, then something keeps sort of like coming back for us.
That
and
boomerang you mentioned.
Boomerang, exactly, right? And going back to where we started with part of this, right? Your body holds on to emotion, right? We think of feelings, we think of emotion as something that like we can choose to not feel or choose not to notice. That is a major undertaking, right? Like think about like working over time to create internal systems, right, that help you repress, that help you avoid these feelings, right? You have to keep reinforcing these structures so that the feelings, in a way, it may seem or feel as if they don't impact you as much as they do. But the more you do that, right, the more you have to keep rebuilding these systems, right? I think your brain needs to continue creating different neural pathways for you to think about said reality, right? Like about your loss, about the things that are no longer there, in a way that it doesn't really apply to that reality, right? Like you have to create an alternate to that reality to create a new set of feelings so that you don't feel as impacted. But what that does is that it creates, one, at the very least, confusion, right, to the internal body as to like what exactly is going on, right? We may know of this as cognitive dissonance, right? We think of one reality while simultaneously experiencing a felt different reality.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And at a baseline, right, like this is confusing because it creates two different realities which cannot coexist, at least not at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? And so it truly does invite us inwardly, because we have to like ground ourselves and come back to ourselves to try to understand what is the version of ourselves that is asking to emerge as part of these experiences.
The version of ourselves that's asking to emerge. You know, you talked, I think there are many salient things, but for sure the boomerang example that we try to discard feelings, but they come right back and they show up, and they often show up at sometimes the most inopportune times. Where you think, okay, I've moved on, I'm in a new relationship, for example. Why is this coming up? Or I've moved cities. Why is this coming up? Or, you know, I've moved on from this loss and I'm now in this place. Why does this keep coming back up? And I think many of us can resonate with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That really resonates with me as the conversation that we've been having, and you've certainly given us many nuggets to think about. In the context of Return to More, articulate sort of why I started this podcast journey, and it was a way for me to look inwardly, to begin to acknowledge many of the emotions and feelings that I had felt regarding not just losses like my Aunt Madeline, but also transitions in life with new jobs and moving to new cities. And so, as you've articulated many things that we need to think about in the context of grief, can you help us distill some of those more salient points for us to consider when we think about grief and what it means to return to more?
Yes. Grief isn't just about what's gone. Grief is about the self that existed in that context. And when that self is gone, we don't erase it, we integrate it into this new self. So,
Wow.
In a way, that grief makes sense to us. So here is a practical tool, something that we can use to try to understand how to move, or at the very least to have a starting point with our grief, right? And it's called grief mapping. This isn't about fixing grief, it's about understanding it, right? Developing a relationship with how we feel. First, we have to name the loss. What feels was lost for us? Not just who or what, but what the loss represents to us. So we ask ourselves, what did this person, relationship, identity, or dream give me? What part of me existed because of it? Then we place it in our body. Notice where grief shows up. Is it on our shoulders? Is it on our gut? Is it on our throat? Is it on our chest? Is it tight? Is it heavy? Is it numb? Is it restless? No analysis, no judgment, just noticing. Then we identify the nervous system state. We ask, am I activated or am I anxious? Am I shutting down or am I numb? Or am I gravitating between the two? Then we offer regulating support, not a solution, just support. Gentle movement, longer exhales, warmth, nourishment, safe connection. think, what do I need that is going to support my body, not to correct the emotion? This practice helps grief move instead of harden. What we want to allow our body to do is to support movement, not stagnation with the feeling.
Wow, I'm sitting here and I'm processing the mapping tool. And Oz, for viewers out there, is there a place where they can access the tool, or the outline that you gave? Is that part of the practice of just being mindfully engaged with the prompts that you listed?
I can certainly type it up and like share it on the website as a tool, or share with you to share on your podcast. This is more as a personal reminder to each of us, right? Even in the moments when your grief does not make sense to you, it makes sense. Sometimes we just have to allow it to be what it is without identifying a judgment or as if there is something wrong with us. Nothing is broken, although it may feel as if it is. Nothing needs fixing, although we may feel like we need to fix something. Grief is not a sign that you are failing, it's a sign that something mattered to you. If you can approach your grief with curiosity instead of judgment, compassion instead of pressure, it will transform, not disappear, but transform. Healing is learning to live with what's been lost while still moving towards what's possible. You don't have to do that alone. And this is a point in which you then take a pulse on yourself and ask, who or what or when or where can I lean on that can help support this process, even if that may be a moment of stillness for you.
Wow. Well, Oz, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. I think it has reminded me that grief is not necessarily something to fix, but something to feel. And so with that, we often find more of ourselves in feeling grief and evolving with it. So in this segment, More to Carry With You, we just heard from our incredible guest, Oz Escobel, who is the clinical director and psychotherapist of Awakening LLC. And he gave us so many nuggets that we're so thankful for about how we can identify grief, acknowledge grief, and respond to grief. But I just want to share a couple of things that I learned from our conversation with you. One, grief requires us to suspend judgment. I think we heard Oz say over and over again that we need to be kind and compassionate to ourselves and allow ourselves to feel the emotions that we may be feeling, however they come up. Heard that. I also heard that grief is part of evolution. It's part of who we evolve. So as we lose people, as we may lose parts of our identity, as we may lose things, right, we still carry those things with us as we evolve. The second idea that really resonated with me from our conversation was this idea that we need to support and not correct. And so you gave us many tools, one, an actual practical grief mapping tool or protocol that we can follow ourselves, but more importantly, a way of thinking. You helped us reframe how thinking about grief as a part of our lives is not something that we need to correct or fix, but lean into. The powerful analogy of the boomerang, right? Like we discard feelings. We may discard those feelings that we identify as hurt or loss or pain. And then, lo and behold, they show right back up, and often not at the most opportune times. And so it's until we process those feelings and emotions that we can truly begin to like lead ourselves toward greater wholeness. And then I would say the third point that you mentioned is I think grief requires vulnerability. And so it's another reason I'm thankful that you came on the podcast to share your story. It's another reason that I feel compelled to share my story with many of you, is that I do think there is power in sharing our stories and sharing our grief with others in a trusted space. I think it not only helps us to process the emotions that we're feeling, but it may also bless someone else who's unsure of how to process their own emotions. And that is one way in which we truly return to more not just helping ourselves, but helping others. We've just had a very important conversation around grief, and thanks to our incredible guest, we learned how we can identify grief, how we can navigate grief, and even how we can think about grief differently. And so, as you know, I always look for moments of joy. So in this segment, more to laugh about. Quick little anecdote of when I was playing tennis. I'm an intense competitor. I hate to lose, love to win, and I was so wrapped up in a game where it was very close. The gentleman I was playing was very good, probably slightly better than me, although I didn't tell him that. But nevertheless, very good. And we were at deuce, 40-40, for those of you who know tennis, and if you don't, the score was even, and I just needed 2 more points to win. And so I went to serve, boom, ace. So now I have 1 more point that I needed to win. And so the key in tennis, because it's also mental, you can't allow yourself to get too far ahead. You have to stay in the moment. And that is my biggest challenge, is staying in the moment. So boom, hit a serve, goes out. I'm like, okay, I'll hit the second serve. Well, lo and behold, my second serve was so far off that it actually hit him on the other side of the net. So thankfully, it wasn't the fastest serve I hit. He laughed it off. Of course, we had to continue playing. I ultimately did win the game. But lesson learned, and stay in the moment, because you don't want to, one, hurt someone. You don't want to hurt yourself. And I'm trying to think subconsciously, maybe this is another conversation with Oz at a different date. Did I intentionally hit him with the second serve? But we'll leave that for another day. Listen, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode, Return to More. I want to thank my guest, Oz Escobel, for sharing such wisdom and insight with us today. You can find this episode where you find all of your podcasts. It's also available on my website at returntomore.com. Additionally, if this conversation has helped you in any way, I ask that you not only subscribe, but that you share it with any and everyone that you care about, for at some point in our lives, if we haven't already, we will be impacted by grief. And until we return to more again, I look forward to seeing you soon.